My daughter-in-law texted her family that I was losing my mind and that it was finally time to take control of my money. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply took a screenshot, and within 48 hours, her entire financial world was frozen solid. Before we get into the details, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are listening from today. I always love seeing where this community gathers from. My name is Helen Benning, and I am 69 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a contract lawyer, specializing in corporate mergers and complex trust structures. I spent my life looking for loopholes, closing them, and protecting assets from people who thought they were smarter than they actually were. I learned a long time ago that in contract law, the most dangerous clauses aren't the ones printed in bold letters at the top of the page. They are the tiny, italicized lines buried at the very bottom. The ones you arrogantly assume you don't need to read. I should have applied that same legal scrutiny to my own family. But when it comes to your children, you tend to skip the fine print. I live alone in a quiet, older neighborhood. My house is paid for. My life is simple. I prefer worn cashmere sweaters that have lasted a decade over anything with a flashy label. My son, David, and his wife, Chloe, live very differently. Whenever they visited, Chloe would walk through my front door carrying an oversized designer handbag with a gold-plated logo so large it practically shouted her insecurities at you. She always smelled of expensive perfume and quiet desperation. Chloe loved to make passive-aggressive comments about my lifestyle. She would look around my living room, sigh dramatically, and say things meant to make me feel small. You know, Helen, you live all alone in this big house, she would say, adjusting her massive diamond ring. It's such a waste. You're just not keeping up with how the world works anymore. You really need us to help you manage things. I never took the bait. I would just sip my tea and let the silence stretch out until she awkwardly changed the subject. I assumed her arrogance was just a personality flaw. I didn't realize it was a strategy. It was a quiet Friday evening. The house was completely still. I was sitting in my study, the warm yellow light from my reading lamp illuminating a stack of old books, my reading glasses resting on the mahogany desk. That was when the soft ping of my phone broke the silence. I picked it up, expecting a reminder for an upcoming doctor's appointment. Instead, the screen glowed with an invitation to an iMessage group chat. The group was named Vegas Trip 2024. Someone had added me by mistake, and as the messages started rolling in, one after another, I realized exactly what kind of mistake it was. Before we get to the messages in that group chat, you need to understand the people who were sending them. You need to understand my son, David, and the woman he married. I live in a house built in 1922. It sits at the end of a long, tree-lined street in a neighborhood where people do not talk about money. They don't have to. The mortgages were paid off decades ago. The roofs are slate. The floors are original oak. And the silence here is deep and heavy. It is a home meant for a family. But for the last 15 years, since my husband passed away, it has just been me. I like the quiet. I earned the quiet. My son, David, is 38 years old. He is a handsome man. He has his father's jawline and my eyes. But somewhere along the way, he lost the ability to build anything real. He works in commercial real estate. Or, more accurately, he plays the role of someone who works in commercial real estate. He wears suits that cost more than my first car. He drives a leased luxury sedan that he trades in every 2 years just to make sure everyone at the country club knows he has a new one. And then there is Chloe. When David first brought Chloe home 5 years ago, I saw exactly what she was. In my 40 years of practicing contract law, I sat across the table from hundreds of people just like her. People who try to mask their deep, structural insolvency with loud, aggressive confidence. Chloe was a walking, talking shell company. She always arrived at my house like she was making a grand entrance at a gala. I hadn't invited her to. I could hear her coming before I saw her. The sharp, aggressive clack of her stiletto heels on my hardwood floors. The heavy, suffocating wave of expensive floral perfume. And always, a massive designer handbag clutched tightly in the crook of her arm. The bag always had a gold-plated logo so large and so shiny, it practically screamed for attention. I never cared about designer labels. I wore the same gray cashmere sweater I had owned for 12 years because it kept me warm. Chloe looked at my sweater the way you might look at a stray dog. She treated my home not as a place to visit her mother-in-law, but as an estate she was impatiently waiting to inherit. She would walk through my living room, her eyes doing a slow, calculating inventory of the antique silver, the Persian rugs, the original oil paintings. I remember one particular Sunday afternoon. About a month before the text messages, it was raining outside. I had made a pot of Earl Grey tea. David was sitting on the sofa, scrolling endlessly on his phone, completely detached from the room. Chloe was pacing. She hated the quiet of my house. She needed noise. She needed to feel superior. She stopped by the large bay window, trailing a perfectly manicured finger over the mahogany sill. She sighed. It was a heavy, theatrical sigh, meant to force me to ask what was wrong. I didn't ask. I just took a sip of my tea. When she realized I wasn't going to play my part, she turned to me. She offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know, Helen," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, syrupy concern she loved to use. "You live all alone in this massive house. It's nearly 4,000 square feet. It's such a waste." I set my teacup down. I did not say a word. "David and I were just talking about it," she continued, gesturing vaguely toward my son, who didn't even look up from his screen. "You're just not keeping up with how the world works anymore. The maintenance, the taxes, the landscaping. It's too much for someone your age. You really need us to step in. You need us to help you manage things before you get completely overwhelmed." She looked at me, waiting for me to argue. She wanted me to get defensive. She wanted me to act like an emotional aging woman who was terrified of losing her independence. I did not give her what she wanted. I simply looked at her. I looked at the oversized logo on her bag. I looked at the nervous way she shifted her weight from one expensive shoe to the other. I saw the desperation bleeding through the arrogance. They didn't want to help me. They were drowning. And they were looking at my home as a life raft. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend my mental capacity. I simply picked up my tea, looked her dead in the eye, and changed the subject entirely. "The rain is supposed to keep up until Tuesday," I said quietly. David finally looked up, letting out a long, audible breath. I saw the visible physical release of tension in his shoulders. He mistook my silence for surrender. He believed, with the same arrogant certainty that had defined his entire adult life, that because I didn't fight back, I was weak. Chloe smiled. A smug, victorious little smirk. She truly believed she had planted the seed, that she had established dominance in my own home, and that she had won. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought I was just a tired old widow who didn't understand modern finance. They forgot that I spent my entire life writing the rules they were desperately trying to break. I remember exactly how the room felt when that first message came through. It was late. The only sound in my house was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I had just poured myself a small glass of red wine, settling into my leather reading chair. When the phone on my desk chimed, I ignored it. I figured it was a spam email or a late-night alert from my news app. But then it chimed again, and again. 3 rapid, aggressive bursts of sound that shattered the quiet of my study. I picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. You have been added to a group chat. Vegas Trip 2024. The creator of the group was my daughter-in-law, Chloe. The other numbers belonged to my son, David, and a few of Chloe's close friends. I knew immediately what had happened. Chloe had a friend named Helene who often planned their vacations. In her rush to create the group and start bragging about her upcoming trip, Chloe's thumb had slipped. She had typed the first few letters, clicked the wrong contact, and blindly thrown me into the center of their private world. I didn't type a word. I didn't announce my presence. My read receipts have been turned off for years. I simply sat in the quiet of my study, the blue light from the screen reflecting in my glasses, and watched the messages roll in. First, it was pictures. Links to a luxury VIP cabana at an expensive resort. A screenshot of a first-class flight itinerary. Then, one of Chloe's friends replied. Her message popped up in a gray bubble. Chloe, this looks amazing. But didn't David just lose that big commercial lease downtown? How are you guys swinging $30,000 for a weekend? There was a pause. The little typing indicator bubbled on Chloe's end for a long time. Then, her response appeared. Don't worry about the money. We finally have a timeline. The old lady is slipping. And we are moving in to take over the accounts next month. I stopped breathing. The air in my study suddenly felt very thin. Very cold. I stared at the words on the glowing screen. The old lady is slipping. Before I could even process the shock of it, another message appeared. This one was from my son, from David. Yeah, David wrote, it's actually getting pretty sad. She's super forgetful lately. I talked to my buddy, Dr. Evans. He's going to do a house call next week under the guise of a routine checkup. He'll document some mild cognitive decline. Once we have that on paper, getting the power of attorney will be a breeze. We'll transfer her main retirement trust into our LLC so we can manage it for her. She won't even realize the money has moved. Chloe immediately replied with a string of laughing emojis. Exactly. We're just being responsible children. Taking care of his poor, confused mother. And once we control the trust, the bank will clear our debts in a heartbeat. You want to believe the best about the people you raised. You spend your whole life making excuses for them. You tell yourself that maybe they are just misguided. Maybe they are just under a lot of pressure. You try to convince yourself that a toxic spouse is dragging your child down, that your son is merely a victim of bad influence. But looking at those messages, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. The words were his. The plan was his. My son was not a bystander in this scheme. He was the architect. They were not just planning to steal my money. They were planning to steal my autonomy. They were going to manufacture a medical diagnosis, strip away my legal rights, and lock me out of the estate I had spent 4 decades building, all so they could pay off the debts of their fake, hollow lifestyle. A normal mother might have broken down. She might have called her son, screaming and crying, demanding an explanation. She might have confronted them, giving them the opportunity to delete the chat, deny everything. and gaslight her into thinking she was crazy. But I was not just a mother. For 40 years, I was a contract lawyer. My entire professional existence was built on finding the trap before the trap closed on me. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sadness. What I felt was an absolute, unassailable sense of clarity. The mother died in that chair. And the lawyer woke up. I immediately began taking screenshots. I captured every single message, every timestamp, every phone number. I didn't just save them to my phone. I emailed the files to my secure 3.8 encrypted cloud server. Then, I turned on the heavy laser printer in the corner of my office. The quiet hum of the machine filled the room as it spit out page after page of high-resolution, time-stamped evidence. I took the warm sheets of paper, placed them inside a manila folder, and locked them in my heavy, fireproof safe. By the time Chloe realized her mistake and hastily removed my number from the group chat 20 minutes later, it was already too late. The ghost was out of the machine. The evidence was secured. They thought I was losing my mind. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded gun to the sharpest legal mind in the city. The next morning, the sun came up just like it always did. The neighborhood was quiet. The light filtered through the heavy curtains in my study, casting long, dusty shadows across the mahogany desk. I had barely slept. But I wasn't tired. My mind was moving with a cold, mechanical precision that I hadn't felt since my days at the firm. I made a pot of black coffee. I poured a cup, walked back into my study, and opened the heavy steel door of my fireproof safe. I took out the manila folder containing the printed screenshots from the night before. I spread the pages out on my desk. In the harsh light of day, the words on the paper looked even more grotesque. I didn't read them as a mother this time. I read them as a lawyer dissecting a hostile takeover. In contract law, we have a concept called intent. You do not just look at what a person did. You look at the premeditation behind it. You look for the pattern. And as I read through those messages again, analyzing every timestamp and every casual joke my son made about my declining mental state, the pattern became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a sudden, desperate idea born out of a bad month in the real estate market. This was a 3-month campaign. I sat back in my chair, holding my warm coffee mug. As the memories of the last few weeks suddenly shifted into focus, the little things, the minor inconveniences that I had brushed off as the natural clumsiness of getting older. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't find my reading glasses. I had spent an hour looking for them, increasingly frustrated, only for Chloe to magically find them tucked behind the microwave. I had felt so foolish. Chloe had patted my hand, using that fake, syrupy voice, telling me that it happens to everyone. 2 weeks ago, David came over for lunch and asked me why I hadn't paid the landscaping bill. I told him I had mailed the check on Tuesday. He pulled the unpaid invoice out of my own recycling bin. Looking at me with deep, manufactured pity, I had started taking memory supplements. I had seriously considered booking an appointment with a neurologist. I had spent nights lying awake in my bed, terrified that the sharpest tool I owned, my mind, was beginning to dull. But looking at the printed messages on my desk, the truth hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't losing my mind. My own son was stealing it. They had been moving my things. They had been hiding my mail. They were intentionally manufacturing a false reality to break down my confidence. They wanted me to doubt my own memory so that when Dr. Evans, David's friend, showed up to document my cognitive decline, I wouldn't even fight the diagnosis. I would just accept it. I would sign the power of attorney, because they had successfully convinced me that I could no longer trust myself. It was a brilliant strategy. Really, if you want to take a woman's wealth, you don't break into her vault. You break her sense of reality until she hands you the combination herself. I felt a profound, chilling emptiness in my chest. You spend your entire life protecting your children. You teach them right from wrong. You pay for their education. You help them with their down payments. You give, and you give, and you give. Assuming that the foundation you built is solid, you never expect that the person you gave everything to is secretly looking for the load-bearing walls of your life, figuring out exactly where to place the explosives. David's commercial real estate business was clearly failing. The messages implied as much. The market had been brutal over the last year, and David had always been over-leveraged, financing his luxury cars and country club memberships on the assumption that the next big deal was always right around the corner. The deals had stopped coming. The debts had caught up, and instead of downgrading his lifestyle, instead of selling his leased car, or asking his wife to stop buying $5,000 handbags, he decided to cannibalize his own mother. I gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and placed them back inside the folder. I locked the safe. The heavy metallic click echoed in the quiet room. I did not call my son. I did not demand an explanation. An amateur reacts to an ambush by screaming into the dark. A professional waits for the enemy to step into the light. Tomorrow was Sunday. Every Sunday. For the last 4 years, David and Chloe came over for dinner. It was a tradition, a performance of happy family life. I knew exactly what they were going to do. They were going to walk through my front door, drink my wine, and look for another opportunity to make me feel small. They were going to try and plant another seed of doubt in my mind. I decided I was going to let them. I was going to set the table, roast a chicken, and give them a front row seat to the exact version of me they desperately wanted to see. By 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, the house smelled of rosemary and roasted chicken. I had spent the morning preparing the meal with exactly the same care I had given every family dinner for the past 4 years. I set the dining room table with the good silver. I polished the crystal water glasses. I wanted everything to be absolutely perfect. I wanted the stage to be set. At exactly 5:15, the heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded. I opened it to find David and Chloe standing on the porch. The crisp autumn air rushed in behind them, but it was immediately overpowered by the heavy, suffocating wave of Chloe's floral perfume. David was wearing a tailored navy blazer, but the edges of his confidence were fraying. I could see the faint, dark circles under his eyes. I noticed the scuff marks on the toes of his expensive leather loafers. The stress of his failing commercial real estate business was bleeding through his polished exterior. Chloe, on the other hand, pushed past me with her usual aggressive energy. Her stiletto heels clicked sharply against the oak floors, sounding like a landlord inspecting a property rather than a daughter-in-law visiting family. She carried a bottle of wine. It was a cheap vintage, I noted, though she presented it with a flourish, as if it were a rare, expensive gift. We moved into the living room. I asked David to open the wine. As I walked past the coffee table, I pulled my small ring of house keys from my pocket and set them down on the polished mahogany surface. I did this deliberately. I made sure the metal clinked loudly against the wood so they would notice. I was giving them the bait. I excused myself and went into the kitchen to check on the dinner. I stood by the oven, watching the second hand on my watch sweep around the dial. I stayed in the kitchen for exactly 4 minutes. When I walked back into the living room, Chloe was sitting on the sofa, scrolling on her phone, looking entirely too innocent. David was pouring the wine. I glanced at the coffee table. The keys were gone. I did not react immediately. We sat down. We drank the cheap wine. Chloe spent the first 20 minutes of our visit complaining about a contractor who was supposedly overcharging them for renovations on their house. Renovations they clearly could not afford. I just listened, nodding at the right intervals. Finally, as we were getting ready to move to the dining room, I reached toward the coffee table. I patted the empty space, frowned, and let out a soft sigh. "That is strange," I murmured, keeping my voice low. "I could have sworn I left my keys right here." Chloe's head snapped up. She put her phone down instantly. Leaning forward, she wore a mask of deep, syrupy concern. But her eyes were bright with anticipation. "What is wrong? Helen? Did you lose something again?" "Just my house keys," I said, injecting just a hint of frail uncertainty into my voice. "I placed them on the table when you arrived." David let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. It was the sound of a man burdened by an impossible responsibility. He stood up, walked over to my armchair, and lifted a heavy, embroidered throw pillow. He reached underneath it and pulled out my keys. He held them up by the metal ring, letting them jingle in the quiet room like a prize. "Mom," David said, his voice dripping with condescension. "They were under the pillow. You tucked them away and forgot." I looked at the keys. I did not point out that the laws of physics do not allow a ring of keys to magically slide underneath a heavy pillow on their own. I did not mention that I had seen Chloe standing near that exact chair just before I went into the kitchen. "I see," I said softly, looking down at my hands. "I suppose I must have." That was the signal Chloe was waiting for. She moved in for the kill. She reached out and patted my knee, her perfectly manicured nails resting against my old cashmere sweater. "Helen, we really need to talk about this," Chloe said softly. "You have been so forgetful lately. The keys, the bills. It is getting dangerous. What if you leave the stove on? What if you forget to lock the doors at night?" David nodded, stepping closer to loom over my chair. "Chloe is right. Mom, we are worried sick about you. You should not have to carry the burden of managing this massive house and all your complex finances when your memory is slipping. It is too much stress. Let us step in. Let me take over the accounts. I can have my lawyer draft a power of attorney this week. It will just be for your own protection, so we can make sure everything is paid on time." I looked at my son. I looked at the woman who was helping him dismantle my independence. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. I closed my eyes for a brief second, rubbing my temples as if I was overwhelmed by the sudden, terrifying realization of my own mental decline. "Maybe," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "Maybe you are right. Let me just think about it." The shift in the room was immediate. It was a physical change in the atmosphere. David let out a long breath, his posture relaxing completely. The tension drained from his shoulders. He looked across the room at Chloe, and Chloe smiled. It was a small, tight, victorious little smirk. She mistook my silence for surrender. She truly believed, with the arrogant certainty of a small-time con artist, that she had won. They thought they had successfully broken my reality. They thought the estate was theirs. They had no idea they were already standing in a trap I had built 25 years ago. They stayed for another hour. Chloe was practically glowing. She drank the rest of the cheap wine and talked endlessly about a luxury cruise she was suddenly interested in booking. David looked like a man who had just outrun a burning building. They left just after 8 o'clock. The heavy front door clicked shut. I stood in the foyer and waited until the taillights of David's leased car disappeared down the street. Then, I opened all the windows in the living room to let the crisp autumn air wash away the lingering stench of Chloe's floral perfume. I walked back into my study. I locked the solid oak door behind me. I did not turn on the main overhead light. Only the small brass reading lamp on my desk. I walked over to the corner of the room, kneeled on the Persian rug, and spun the heavy brass dial of my fireproof safe. 34, 12, 68. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. I reached past the manila folder containing the printed text messages from the night before. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was heavy. The leather was worn at the edges, softened by time and memory. I carried it to my desk, set it down under the warm circle of light, and opened it. Inside was a document I had drafted myself, exactly 25 years ago. The Benning Family Trust. When people hear the word trust, they usually think of a simple financial account. They think of a wealthy grandparent leaving a few $1,000s for a college fund. Something easily managed, easily moved. But I was not a small-town family lawyer. I spent my career dealing in corporate mergers and complex asset protection. I spent 40 years making sure that corporations could not be dismantled by greedy stakeholders. When I built the financial architecture for my own family, I built a fortress. The money they were after, the portfolio that funded my quiet life, paid for this massive house, and secretly backed David's emergency credit lines, was not sitting in a checking account. It was locked inside an irrevocable trust. In contract law, the word irrevocable means exactly what it sounds like. It cannot be canceled. It cannot be altered. And most importantly, it cannot be accessed or drained by a single person holding a generic piece of paper. When my husband Arthur was still alive, we sat at this very desk and signed these papers. Arthur was a good man, but he was too trusting. He always believed David would eventually grow out of his arrogance and learn the value of hard work. I wanted to believe it too. But as a lawyer, I do not deal in hope. I deal in risk mitigation. I told Arthur that if our son ever lost his way, we needed a wall that he could not climb over. David and Chloe thought they had figured out a brilliant loophole. They thought that by having a doctor declare me mentally unfit, a standard power of attorney would give them absolute control over my estate. They assumed they could just walk into my bank, slap a piece of paper on the manager's desk, and wire the funds directly into their failing business accounts. They did not read the fine print, because if they had, they would have known about Section 4, Paragraph 2, the dual signature clause. When I drafted the trust, I knew that money changes people. I had seen it destroy families 100 times over in my firm's conference rooms. So, I built in a fail-safe. I appointed myself as the primary trustee, but I also designated a secret co-trustee, a silent partner, a second key to the nuclear submarine. According to the foundational charter of the trust, any major transfer of assets, any change in management, or any attempt to freeze the accounts required the explicit, notarized signature of both trustees. My signature alone was useless if the co-trustee did not agree. And if someone tried to use a power of attorney to force a transfer while I was supposedly incapacitated, the banking system would immediately trigger a total automatic asset freeze until the co-trustee could conduct a full legal review. The person I chose as my co-trustee was not a family member. Family is too emotional. Family can be manipulated. I chose someone who understood the law as coldly and clinically as I did. Someone who had spent his life hunting down financial discrepancies. I ran my hand over the thick, cream-colored paper. The ink was old, but the legal weight of those words was absolute. David was planning to bring his friend, Dr. Evans, to my house next week to document my supposed cognitive decline. He was going to use that fabricated medical record to force me to sign away my rights. He was going to try and take the keys to the castle. I decided I was not going to stop him. I was going to let him bring the doctor. I was going to let him draft the fraudulent power of attorney. I was going to let him and Chloe walk right into the bank and present their forged reality to the world. Because in the legal world, intending to commit fraud is a problem. But actually presenting fraudulent documents to a federally insured bank? That is a felony. I closed the leather portfolio. I sat in the silence of my study, feeling an absolute, unassailable sense of calm. There was no anger left in me. Anger is a messy emotion. It clouds your judgment and makes you sloppy. What I felt was the cold, mechanical precision of a professional preparing for trial. My son wanted to treat me like a mark. He was about to find out that I was the house, and the house always wins. I picked up my phone. It was time to wake up the co-trustee. Monday morning was gray and bitterly cold. A heavy, freezing rain had been falling since midnight, turning the city streets into slick, dark mirrors. At 6 o'clock in the morning, while David and Chloe were likely still asleep in their heavily mortgaged suburban home, I was sitting in a booth at a rundown diner on the industrial edge of the city. It was the kind of place that smelled permanently of burnt coffee, bleach, and old grease. The vinyl seats were cracked, patched with layers of duct tape. I chose it specifically because it was a place where nobody from my neighborhood, and certainly nobody from David's country club circle, would ever set foot. I ordered a cup of black coffee. It arrived in a thick, chipped ceramic mug. I wrapped my hands around the warm porcelain and waited. At exactly 10 minutes past 6, the bell above the diner door jingled. Marcus walked in. Marcus is 72 years old, 3 years older than I am. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal wool coat and carried a leather briefcase that cost more than the car parked outside the diner window. He looked entirely out of place in this cheap diner. But Marcus has always possessed the ability to look completely in control of any room he enters. We practiced law together for 35 years. Before he went to law school, Marcus was a forensic accountant. He spent his entire career hunting down hidden assets, auditing corrupt executives, and untangling webs of financial deceit that took years to build. We were partners. We were ruthless when we needed to be. And 25 years ago, when I drafted the Benning Family Trust, he was the only person on this earth I trusted enough to name as my secret co-trustee. He slid into the booth across from me. He didn't bother looking at the laminated menu. He just looked at me. "You look tired." "Helen," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "I am wide awake." "Marcus," I replied quietly. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick manila folder. I slid it across the sticky Formica table. The heavy paper made a crisp, scratching sound as it moved. Marcus opened the folder. Inside were the printed screenshots from the Vegas Trip 2024 group chat, the time-stamped evidence of my own son plotting to manufacture a medical diagnosis, strip away my legal autonomy, and raid my estate to fund his failing lifestyle. I watched Marcus read. A lesser man might have gasped. A normal friend might have reached across the table, offered me empty sympathy, and told me how incredibly sorry they were that my family was doing this to me. But Marcus is not a normal friend. And he is certainly not a lesser man. He read every single page with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. His expression did not change. His eyes just moved methodically down the lines of text. When he reached the last page, he closed the folder, aligned the edges perfectly, and folded his hands on top of it. "They are going to try to declare you mentally unfit," Marcus said, his tone entirely matter-of-fact. "David is bringing a doctor to my house next week." I told him, "A friend of his, Dr. Evans. They are going to use him to document a false history of cognitive decline. Once they have the medical paperwork, they are going to draft a power of attorney and try to take over my accounts." Marcus let out a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh. A standard power of attorney is useless against an irrevocable trust. The dual signature clause will lock the accounts down the second they try to present that forged document to a bank manager. "I know," I said. I looked down at my black coffee, watching the dark liquid ripple as a heavy truck drove past the diner outside. But simply blocking the transfer is not enough. If I just stop them at the bank, David will cry. He will apologize. And he will pretend it was a misunderstanding. He will gaslight me. I am not going to give him that chance. I looked back up, meeting Marcus's sharp eyes. "I need to know exactly why he is this desperate," I said. "The text messages prove his intent. But I need you to find the motive. I need a full forensic audit of David's life. Every commercial real estate deal he has closed in the last 3 years. Every shell company he manages. I want to see the limits on his lines of credit. I want to know exactly how much debt Chloe is hiding in those designer handbags. I want to know what they owe and who they owe it to." Marcus tapped his index finger against the manila folder. The machinery in his mind was already turning. I could see it. He thrives on this. He loves pulling on a loose thread to see what completely unravels. "David has been over-leveraged for years," Marcus murmured, almost to himself. "The commercial market has been brutal lately. If his liquidity is gone, he is likely moving money between shell companies just to make the minimum payments. Find it." I told him, "I want every single financial sin they have committed laid out on paper. When they walk into that bank to try and steal my life, I am going to make sure they walk out with absolutely nothing." Marcus slipped the manila folder into his expensive leather briefcase. He buttoned his charcoal coat. "Give me 72 hours, he said quietly. "I will tear his financial world down to the studs." He stood up and walked out into the freezing rain, leaving me alone in the quiet diner. The investigation had officially begun, and David and Chloe, sitting in their expensive, crumbling house, had absolutely no idea that a silent, invisible noose was already tightening around their necks. For the next 72 hours, I played my part perfectly. I answered Chloe's daily, suffocatingly sweet phone calls. I let my voice waver just a little bit when she asked what I had eaten for lunch. Pretending I could not quite remember if I had eaten a sandwich or a salad, I could practically hear her smiling through the receiver. She thought the foundation of my mind was cracking. She had no idea her own foundation was already entirely demolished. On Thursday evening, just after 8 o'clock, a quiet knock sounded at my back door. I unlocked the deadbolt. It was Marcus. He stepped into my kitchen, shaking the freezing rain from his heavy charcoal coat. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply walked straight into my study. I set his leather briefcase on my mahogany desk and popped the brass latches. The sharp metallic clicks echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out a stack of documents nearly 3 inches thick and dropped it under the warm circle of my reading lamp. "I asked you to find the rot," Marcus said, his gravelly voice devoid of any emotion. "I did not have to dig very deep. The entire house is coming down. Helen, they are not just greedy. They are financially terminal." I sat down in my leather chair, put on my reading glasses, and began to read. In my 40 years of practicing law, I have audited hundreds of failing businesses, But looking at my own son's financial records was a different kind of autopsy. David's commercial real estate firm was not just struggling, it was a completely hollow shell. 2 years ago, he had taken out a massive bridge loan to purchase a commercial warehouse complex on the edge of the city. He gambled heavily on securing a major corporate tenant to sign a 10-year lease. He wanted to be the big man, the visionary developer, but the tenant backed out. The building had been sitting empty for 24 months, bleeding taxes and maintenance fees. To keep up appearances, David had started moving money between 3 different shell companies, using new credit to pay off old interest. It is a classic survival tactic for desperate men, and it always ends in disaster. His commercial lenders had finally lost patience. Marcus explained, tapping a manicured finger on a formal letter of default buried in the stack. They called in the loan. He owes a balloon payment of $2.4 million by the 30th of this month. If he does not pay it, they are going to seize the commercial property and trigger a cross-default clause. I stopped reading and looked up at Marcus. A cross-default clause. Yes. Marcus nodded slowly. To secure the original warehouse loan, your brilliant son cross-collateralized his primary residence. If the commercial property goes into foreclosure, the bank takes his house too. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together in my mind. The sudden urgency, the manufactured dementia, the fake power of attorney they were trying to shove in front of me. They did not just want a bigger lifestyle. If they did not drain my retirement trust by the end of the month, they were going to be completely sereny, publicly homeless. I turned the page, moving from David's failures to Chloe's. If David was drowning in corporate debt, Chloe was burying them in retail poison. Marcus had pulled her credit history. She had 5 active premium credit cards. Every single one of them was maxed out to the absolute limit. She was carrying over $80,000 in revolving consumer debt, paying nothing but the minimum balances at 26% interest. The designer handbags she paraded around my living room, the expensive floral perfume, the 5-star dinners she constantly posted about on the internet. They were all financed by money that did not actually exist. Even the luxury car parked in their driveway, the one David polished every Sunday to impress the neighbors, was 90 days past due. The repo company was likely already looking for it. I sat back in my chair. I took off my glasses and rubbed the bridge of my nose. The absolute, undeniable scale of their delusion was breathtaking. They had built a glittering, expensive fortress out of paper. And instead of taking responsibility when the wind started blowing, they decided the easiest solution was to burn down my life to warm their own hands. They need the cash to cure the commercial default and pay off the retail lines, Marcus said quietly. They are planning to walk into your bank the moment they have that medical document and wire the entirety of your trust into their holding account. They think it will save them. I looked at the stack of papers, the evidence of my son's ultimate failure. I did not feel a shred of pity. Pity is for people who make honest mistakes. What David and Chloe were doing was a premeditated assassination of my independence. Let them try. I whispered. Let them bring the doctor. Let them draft the papers. Let them walk into the bank and present their forged reality to the world. Marcus smiled. It was a cold, fleeting expression. He closed his briefcase. I will have the co-trustee lockdown protocols primed directly with the bank's central fraud division. He said, when they trigger the wire transfer, the system will not just decline it. It will freeze every single account tied to their names. Marcus stepped back out into the freezing rain, leaving me alone in my study. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the mice to walk through the front door. Friday and Saturday passed in a heavy dulces. Quiet blur. I knew Marcus was working behind the scenes, tearing through the financial wreckage of my son's life, pulling up bank statements, pulling down shell company registrations. I just had to play the waiting game. But Chloe was not content to just wait for the doctor's appointment. She was getting desperate. She needed to accelerate the narrative of my decline, to make sure I was completely broken and compliant by the time they put the paperwork in front of me. She arrived at my house unannounced on Saturday morning. It was just past 10 o'clock. She was carrying a box of expensive pastries from a bakery downtown and wearing a designer trench coat that rustled loudly when she walked. She said she just wanted to check on me, to make sure I was managing everything okay on my own. I let her in. I made tea. I played the role of the tired, slightly confused, grateful mother-in-law. About 20 minutes into her visit, she excused herself to use the powder room in the hallway. I stayed in the kitchen, pouring a second cup of tea. A few seconds later, a loud, sharp click echoed from the corridor, and the lights in the kitchen and the living room went completely dark. The sudden silence was heavy. The low, familiar hum of the refrigerator simply stopped. Chloe hurried back into the kitchen, her eyes wide with a perfectly manufactured, theatrical panic. "Oh my God. Helen," she gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "What happened? Did you leave the space heater on in the guest bedroom again? You know the wiring in this old house cannot handle it. You are going to blow a fuse and start a fire." I did not own a space heater. I had never owned a space heater in my entire life. My home has central heating, and I keep it at exactly 68 degrees. I looked at her. I let my hands tremble just slightly as I set my teacup down on the dark granite counter. "I do not know," I whispered, keeping my voice frail and uncertain. "I do not remember turning anything on this morning." Chloe rushed to my side, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. It was a suffocating embrace, smelling overwhelmingly of her heavy floral perfume. "It is okay," she cooed, her voice thick with fake, sugary sympathy. "This is exactly what David and I were talking about last Sunday. It is getting too dangerous for you to be here alone. You are forgetting things. Helen, you could burn the house down. Just sit here. I will go check the breaker panel in the hallway for you." She walked out of the kitchen. I heard the metal door of the electrical panel slide open. There was a dull thud, and suddenly the lights flickered back on. The refrigerator hummed back to life. She returned a moment later, looking like a hero who had just rescued an old woman from a burning building. She stayed for another hour, lecturing me gently about fire hazards and memory loss. She told me David was going to move the doctor's appointment up to Tuesday because they were just so worried about my physical safety. I nodded slowly. I thanked her for her help. I let her walk out the front door, truly believing she had executed a psychological masterpiece. There was a visible, profound relief washing over her features as she left. She mistook my silence for complete cognitive surrender. She believed, with the absolute arrogance of a predator who thinks the prey is already dead, that she had won. She did not know that 3 days earlier, anticipating exactly this kind of escalation. I had purchased a set of high-definition, motion-activated security cameras. They were tiny, black squares, not much larger than a postage stamp. I had spent my career dealing with hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. I know how to document a timeline. One of those cameras was tucked inside the ventilation grate in the hallway, pointing directly at the electrical panel. Another was hidden on the third shelf of my study, nestled perfectly between a row of thick, heavy legal encyclopedias I had owned since the late 1980s. That evening, sitting alone in my quiet study with a glass of red wine, I opened the encrypted application on my laptop. I pulled up the footage from the hallway camera. The video was crystal clear. I watched Chloe walk out of the kitchen. She did not go to the powder room. She walked straight to the electrical panel, opened the gray metal door, and deliberately reached up to pull the main breaker switch for the front half of the house. Then, she stood in the dark for exactly 5 seconds, arranged her face into an expression of shock and concern, and hurried back to the kitchen to convince me I was losing my mind. I watched the short video clip 3 times. I did not feel angry. Anger is loud and sloppy. I felt a cold, sharp precision. There is a very specific kind of darkness required to intentionally terrify an elderly woman in her own home, to try and break her grasp on reality, just to steal her money to pay off a credit card bill. I saved the video file. I emailed a copy to my encrypted cloud server. I sent another copy directly to Marcus. They wanted to build a medical history of my decline. They did not realize they were actually building a criminal record of elder abuse and fraud. And the doctor was coming on Tuesday. I could hardly wait. Tuesday arrived with a pale, washed-out winter sun. The house was quiet, the air inside perfectly still. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I watched through the sheer curtains of my living room window as David pulled his leased luxury sedan into my driveway. He was not alone. A man stepped out of the passenger side. He wore a heavy camel hair overcoat and carried a sleek leather medical bag. But he did not look like a seasoned medical professional. With his slicked back hair and a forced, overly bright smile, he looked exactly like a man who spent his Tuesday afternoons drinking expensive scotch at a country club, likely paying for it with money he did not actually have. This was Dr. Evans. I opened the front door before they could even use the heavy brass knocker. I smiled. I played the role of the gracious, slightly tired hostess perfectly. David kissed my cheek. His hands were freezing, and I could feel a slight tremor in his fingers. The stress of his failing commercial real estate empire was physically breaking him down. "Mom," he said, his voice dripping with that familiar, synthetic sweetness. "This is my good friend, Dr. Evans. We were just in the neighborhood, and I asked him to do a quick, informal wellness check. Just a chat. Really, to make sure you are doing perfectly fine." I invited them into the living room. I offered them tea, which they declined. We sat down. The doctor took the armchair across from me. He unbuttoned his expensive overcoat, revealing a heavy gold Rolex on his wrist, a flashy piece of jewelry that contrasted sharply with the cheap, disposable ballpoint pen he pulled from his pocket, along with a standard legal pad. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to project an aura of friendly, casual concern. "So, Helen," Dr. Evans began, his tone patronizingly slow, exactly the way you might speak to a toddler or a very slow dog. "David tells me you have been having a little trouble keeping track of things lately. That is completely normal at your age. But just to be safe, I am going to ask you a few very simple questions. Can you tell me what day of the week it is?" I did not answer him immediately. I just looked at him. I looked at the cheap pen hovering over the legal pad. I looked at David, who was sitting on the edge of the sofa, holding his breath, waiting for me to fumble. "Helen?" Dr. Evans prompted, his smile faltering just a fraction of an inch under my silent stare. "Can you count backwards from 100 by sevens for me?" I took a slow, deep breath. I let the silence in the room stretch out until it became heavy, almost suffocating. The mother who had roasted a chicken on Sunday was gone. The contract lawyer who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate predators was sitting in the chair. "Dr. Evans," I said. My voice was low, perfectly steady, and utterly devoid of any warmth. Before you write a single syllable on that legal pad, I need to ask you a question. Are you intimately familiar with the state medical board regulations regarding diagnostic fraud? The pen stopped moving. The fake, patronizing smile vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sharp look of confusion. I did not raise my voice. I leaned forward just slightly, locking my eyes entirely on him, because what you are attempting to do in my living room right now is not a wellness check. It is the preliminary step in a premeditated conspiracy to manufacture a fraudulent medical record. You are attempting to establish a false clinical baseline of dementia to facilitate the unauthorized transfer of a federally protected irrevocable trust. David shot up from the sofa. "Mom? What are you talking about?" he stammered, his face suddenly draining of color. "He is just asking a few questions." I ignored my son completely. I kept my eyes fixed on the doctor. I watched the heavy gold watch on his wrist slip down slightly as his hand began to tremble. "If you put my name on a medical document claiming I am cognitively impaired," I continued, my words slicing through the quiet room like a scalpel, "I will not just sue you for medical malpractice. I will have my co-trustee initiate a forensic audit of your entire private practice. Because in my 40 years of practicing corporate law, I have found that a doctor who is willing to commit medical fraud for a friend on a Tuesday afternoon usually has a long, documented history of billing irregularities." The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Evans looked at me, truly looked at me, and realized he had walked into a slaughterhouse. He saw the cold, unblinking certainty in my eyes. He realized instantly that whatever lies David had told him about a confused, vulnerable old woman were completely false. He stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his expensive leather bag. He did not say a word. He shoved his cheap pen into his pocket, grabbed his bag, and walked straight out the front door without even looking back at my son. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. David was left standing in the middle of my living room, completely paralyzed. His medical ambush had just spectacularly imploded. But he was desperate. A man staring down a multi-million-dollar commercial loan default does not simply give up when his first plan fails. He just moves on to the next desperate gamble. I looked at my son. I offered him a small, polite smile. "Well," I said quietly, "that was a very short visit. Was there anything else you needed, David, or should I go back to my reading?" David did not stay long after his fake doctor fled my house. He could not even look me in the eye. He mumbled something about having an emergency meeting at his office and practically ran out the front door. I watched his luxury car speed down the street, and I knew exactly what was coming next. Desperation is a very predictable emotion. When a man is drowning, he does not carefully plan his next move. He just thrashes. He reaches for whatever is closest to him, even if it means pulling someone else under. David had exactly 9 days left before his commercial lenders called in. The $2.4 million balloon payment. His medical ambush had completely failed. He did not have the time to find another crooked doctor. He did not have the time to play the long game anymore. He had to force the issue. He came back to my house on Thursday evening. It was raining again. A cold, miserable downpour. He walked in holding a thick manila folder, his hair plastered to his forehead, his expensive tailored suit completely soaked. He looked terrible. The skin around his eyes was gray and sunken. His hands were physically shaking. He walked straight into my study, where I was sitting by the fire, and dropped the folder onto my mahogany desk. The wet paper made a heavy slapping sound against the wood. "Mum?" he said, forcing a heavy, exhausted sigh. My accountant was looking over the family trust structures today. We have a massive tax liability coming up at the end of the year. I need you to sign a few routine administrative forms so we can restructure the holding accounts and avoid the penalty. It was a terrible lie. It was sloppy. It was the kind of lie a failing real estate developer tells a junior contractor to buy himself another week on an unpaid invoice. I put my book down. I walked over to the desk. I opened the folder. There were about 20 pages of dense, boilerplate tax documents. Standard forms. Useless. Bureaucratic filler. But tucked right in the middle, around page 12, was a single sheet of paper printed on slightly heavier stock. It was a general durable power of attorney. It was drafted poorly. I could tell immediately he had downloaded a generic legal template off the internet and just filled in my name and his. It granted him absolute, unrestricted authority to act on my behalf in all financial, legal, and real estate matters. It was the key to my entire life. Hidden quietly between a state tax declaration and a generic disclosure form. I stood there in the quiet of my study, the rain lashing against the window, and I looked at my son. Just sign at the bottom where the sticky notes are. Mom, he said, his voice tight, hovering right over my shoulder. I will take them straight to the notary in my office tomorrow morning. You do not even have to worry about it. I did not argue. I did not point out the fraudulent document. I did not scream at him for trying to steal my independence. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my heavy silver fountain pen. In the 40 years I spent practicing contract law, I encountered every kind of coercion you can imagine. I sat in rooms where people were blackmailed, threatened, and financially starved into signing away their companies. Because of that, very early in my career, I developed a failsafe, a ghost in the machine. I have 2 signatures. The first is my legal signature. It is smooth, looping, and perfectly consistent. It is the signature on my driver's license, my passport, and the master charter of the Benning Family Trust. The second signature is the one I use when I am signing a document under duress, or when I want to guarantee that a document can be legally invalidated by a forensic handwriting expert later. To the untrained eye, it looks identical, but the loop on the capital letter of my first name is deliberately broken, and there is a sharp, horizontal strike right through the center of my last name. It is a distress signal, written entirely in ink. I clicked the cap off my pen. I flipped through the stack of papers. When I reached the power of attorney, I did not hesitate. I pressed the silver nib to the heavy paper and signed my name. I broke the loop. I struck the line. I signed the rest of the worthless tax forms, capped my pen, and closed the folder. I handed it back to my son. The physical change in him was instantaneous. The shaking in his hands stopped entirely. The color rushed back into his face. He clutched that folder to his chest like a man who had just been handed a pardon from the governor. He did not just think he had won. He believed he had outsmarted me. He looked at me and genuinely believed that my 40 years of legal experience meant absolutely nothing against his sheer willpower. He mistook my silence for complete cognitive surrender. "Thanks, Mom," he breathed out, a genuine, relieved smile finally breaking across his face. "I will handle everything from here. You just relax." "I will." "David," I said quietly. Watching him turn and practically sprint back out into the freezing rain, "I certainly will." In the world of high-stakes corporate law, there is a very specific, very dangerous window of time. It is the period between the moment a hostile contract is signed and the moment it is actually executed by the bank. For a seasoned lawyer, that window is a tense, calculated waiting game. But for an amateur, that window feels like victory. They see their name on the dotted line. They feel the heavy paper in their hands. And they completely drop their guard. David and Chloe dropped their guard entirely. Friday morning arrived. I knew exactly what my son was doing. He took that fraudulent power of attorney, the one bearing my deliberately broken signature, straight to his failing real estate office. He likely had his loyal, underpaid secretary stamp it with her notary seal, completely ignoring the fact that she had not actually witnessed me sign the document. That is illegal. Of course. But desperate men do not care about notary laws when they are staring down a $2.4 million default. By Friday afternoon, they believed they held the absolute legal rights to my entire estate. And because they are people who measure their worth entirely by what they can buy, they immediately started spending money. They did not actually have debt. Just after 6 o'clock that evening, my phone vibrated on the desk in my study. It was a text message from Marcus. He did not say hello. He just sent a single, heavily encrypted financial report. I opened the file. Marcus had tapped into their recent credit inquiries. David and Chloe had just visited the most exclusive foreign auto dealership in the city, using the promise of a massive impending wire transfer from my trust as collateral. David had authorized a non-refundable $10,000 credit card charge to reserve a brand new, fully loaded luxury SUV, the kind of car that costs more than most people make in 3 years. I looked at the number on the screen. $10,000. A deposit on a car. While his commercial lenders were preparing to seize his business and his home, the absolute, undeniable scale of their delusion was staggering. But they did not stop at the car dealership. An hour later, I opened my social media account. I rarely use it, mostly just to keep up with old colleagues. But Chloe is the kind of woman who cannot experience a single moment of her life without broadcasting it to the world. I clicked on her public profile. She had just posted a new video. They were sitting at the corner table of a 5-star steakhouse downtown. The kind of place with dark mahogany walls and waiters wearing white gloves. The camera panned across a massive seafood tower resting on a bed of crushed ice. Then, it swung over to David. He was wearing a fresh silk tie, holding a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. The dark circles under his eyes were suddenly gone, replaced by the flushed, arrogant glow of a man who believed he had just successfully robbed a bank. Chloe flipped the camera to herself. She was wearing a new diamond necklace. She raised her glass to the lens, her heavily manicured fingers glittering in the dim restaurant light. Cheers to new beginnings. Chloe purred into the camera, her voice thick with that fake, syrupy sweetness. And cheers to family stepping up when it really matters. I turned the volume up, in the background of the video, just barely audible over the low hum of the restaurant. I heard David speak. The old woman finally gave up. He said, letting out a short, triumphant laugh. Tomorrow morning, we go to the bank, and every single account will be in our name. We are untouchable now. I watched the video 3 times. I listened to my son call me the old woman. I listened to him celebrate the theft of my independence. There was a time, perhaps a decade ago, when hearing those words would have broken my heart. I would have cried. I would have wondered where I went wrong as a mother. But sitting in the quiet of my study, watching the blue light of the screen reflect in my glasses, I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I did not feel anger, either. What I felt was the cold, mechanical anticipation of a trap springing shut. They mistook my silence for surrender. They believed, with the same arrogant certainty that had defined their entire adult lives, that because I am an elderly woman, I must be weak. They truly believed that a downloaded legal template and a fake notary stamp were enough to dismantle a financial fortress I had spent 40 years building for Thriss. There was a visible, profound relief radiating from them in that video. They were at the absolute peak of their false triumph. They were drinking expensive champagne, dreaming about their new luxury car, completely convinced that their financial sins had been washed away. They had absolutely no idea that Marcus had already primed the fraud division at my wealth management bank. I closed the laptop. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of chamomile tea. I stood by the window, looking out into the cold, dark street. Tomorrow was Saturday. The private wealth management branch downtown was open for high-net-worth clients by appointment only. I knew David had already booked a private room. I knew exactly what they were going to do. They were going to walk through those heavy glass doors, slap that fraudulent paper on the manager's desk, and demand the keys to my kingdom. I took a slow sip of my tea. The waiting was finally over. The house always wins, and it was time to collect. There is a very specific kind of quiet that exists inside a private wealth management firm. It is not like a normal retail bank. There are no velvet ropes. There are no teller lines. There is no loud chatter. The floors are polished, Italian marble. The desks are heavy mahogany, and the air always smells faintly of expensive coffee and old money. It is a place designed to make you feel incredibly secure, provided you actually belong there. On Saturday morning, at 8:30, I walked through the heavy glass doors of my bank downtown. Marcus was right beside me. We were escorted immediately to Conference Room A, a large, soundproof glass office overlooking the main lobby floor. We sat down at the long polished table with Richard Sterling, the senior branch manager. Richard and I have known each other for 20 years. He is a meticulous, sharp man who takes his fiduciary duties very seriously. When Marcus had contacted the bank's internal fraud division the day before, Richard had personally overseen the lockdown of my accounts. Now, all we had to do was wait for the criminals to arrive. At exactly 9:15, I saw them. I sat back in my leather chair, perfectly hidden behind the frosted glass of the conference room, and watched my son and my daughter-in-law walk into the bank. They looked exactly like two people who believed they had just won the lottery. David was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his shoulders pulled back, completely radiating that arrogant, unearned confidence he loved to project. Chloe was walking right next to him. She was wearing her heavy designer trench coat and carrying her massive, logo-covered handbag clutched tightly in the crook of her arm. Her stiletto heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. It was a loud, aggressive sound that echoed across the hushed room. She looked around the lobby, her eyes doing a slow, evaluating sweep of the expensive artwork and the leather chairs. She was not just looking at the bank, she was looking at her new kingdom. They walked up to the reception desk. David spoke to the concierge, flashing a bright, perfectly practiced smile. A moment later, a junior wealth manager, a young man named Harrison, walked out to greet them. Harrison shook David's hand and led them to an open desk right in the center of the lobby. Through the glass, I had a perfect view of everything. I watched David sit down. He did not look nervous. He did not look guilty. He looked utterly, completely entitled. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the manila folder, the folder containing the fraudulent power of attorney with my broken signature. He slid it across the heavy mahogany desk. He tapped it once with his index finger. Even through the soundproof glass, I could read his body language perfectly. He was playing the role of the exhausted, responsible son, stepping in to manage his poor. Sick mother's estate. Harrison opened the folder. He looked at the document. He nodded sympathetically. Then, he turned to his computer monitor and began typing. In my 40 years of practicing law, I have seen a lot of people make terrible mistakes. But watching my own son sit in that chair, casually trying to steal the financial security I had spent my entire life building, I felt a profound shift inside me. The very last drop of maternal leniency completely evaporated. I did not look at him as a mother looking at her child anymore. I looked at him as a lawyer, looking at a hostile corporate raider. I turned my attention back to the lobby. Harrison took the fraudulent document and placed it face down on the glass scanner next to his keyboard. A bright green light swept across the machine. The digital copy of the forged power of attorney was fed directly into the bank's central processing system. David leaned back in his chair. He crossed his legs. He looked over at Chloe and offered her a small, victorious smile. Chloe smiled back, reaching out to gently squeeze his arm. They were so relaxed. They were already spending the money in their heads. They were already thinking about the new luxury car, the paid-off credit cards. The grand illusion of their wealthy life finally made real. They had absolutely no idea that a digital guillotine had just dropped over their necks. Inside conference room A, the silence was broken by the sharp ping of an alert on Richard Sterling's laptop. Richard looked down at his screen. The reflection of a bright, flashing red notification lit up his glasses. He read the alert, reached out, and quietly closed his laptop. He looked up at me, and then he looked at Marcus. "The system just tripped," Richard said, his voice low and completely professional. "David Benning just presented a general power of attorney to execute an immediate place. Total asset transfer. He requested a wire of $2.4 million to a commercial holding account and another wire of $80,000 to a retail checking account." Marcus let out a soft, gravelly hum. "He went for everything." "Everything," Richard confirmed. The dual signature lock engaged immediately. The transaction is hard declined. And as of this exact second, a total asset freeze has been applied to every account associated with his Social Security number across our entire banking network. I looked through the frosted glass, out in the lobby. Harrison was staring at his computer monitor, his brow furrowed in confusion. David leaned forward, asking a question, completely unaware that his entire financial existence had just been permanently shut off. I picked up my coffee cup. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast tasted incredibly bitter and incredibly good. "All right, Richard," I said quietly, setting the cup down on the polished table. "I think it is time we go out there and explain the fine print to my son." Richard Sterling stood up from the conference table. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, his expression completely neutral. The perfect picture of a senior wealth manager about to deliver devastating news. Marcus picked up his heavy leather briefcase. I simply smoothed a tiny wrinkle from my old cashmere sweater, and the three of us walked out of conference room A together. The main lobby was still perfectly hushed. The air smelled of expensive espresso and polished mahogany. As we approached the center desk, I could hear young Harrison's voice. He sounded apologetic, but extremely firm. "I am sorry. Mr. Benning," Harrison was saying, pointing at his computer monitor. "The system is rejecting the wire transfer. In fact, it is not just declining the transaction. It is showing a hard administrative lock on all associated accounts to—" David laughed. It was a sharp, nervous, arrogant sound. "That is impossible. You have the power of attorney right in front of you." My mother is legally incapacitated. I am the sole financial proxy. Try scanning the document again. Chloe shifted in her leather guest chair, clutching her massive designer handbag tightly against her chest like a shield. This is completely ridiculous, she snapped, her heavy floral perfume wafting into the quiet space. We have a wire deadline at noon for our commercial holdings. You need to push this through manually right now. He cannot do that. Chloe, I said. My voice was not loud. I did not yell. I did not need to. But in the pristine acoustics of that marble-floored lobby, my words landed like a physical blow. David whipped his head around. The color completely drained from his face in a single second. He looked at me. Then he looked at Marcus. And finally, he looked at Richard Sterling, standing firmly by my side. The false reality he had spent 3 months building shattered instantly. "Mom?" David whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the confident bravado he had projected just moments earlier. What are you doing here?" Chloe's mouth actually dropped open. She looked completely paralyzed. The smug, triumphant woman from the 5-star steakhouse video the night before was entirely gone. She stared at me as if she had just seen a ghost walk through the heavy glass doors of the bank. Richard stepped forward. He did not look at the fraudulent paper resting on Harrison's desk. He looked directly at my son. "Mr. Benning," Richard said, his tone clinical and absolute. "At 9:17 this morning, you attempted to wire $2.4 million from an irrevocable trust. Using a general power of attorney, that document is completely invalid." "It is notarized," David argued, pure desperation suddenly clawing at the edges of his voice. He stood up, knocking his chair back against the marble floor. "It is a legally binding document. She signed it. A standard power of attorney cannot bypass a dual signature clause on an irrevocable trust." Marcus interjected. His gravelly baritone cut through David's rising panic effortlessly. Marcus stepped up to the desk, popped the brass latches of his heavy leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick stack of files. "Furthermore, the signature you provided is defective. It contains a deliberate strike-through, an established legal distress marker indicating coercion. You did not just submit an invalid document, David. You submitted a forged one." I watched my son process the words, dual signature clause, defective signature, forged document. The heavy, undeniable weight of his failure was crashing down on him all at once. The physical change was staggering. His shoulders slumped. His hands began to tremble so violently he had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk just to keep himself standing. "You set me up," David breathed out, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You knew everything. You set yourself up, David." I replied quietly. "I simply allowed you to present your true character to the world." Chloe jumped up, her stiletto heels scraping loudly and awkwardly against the polished stone floor. "Helen, you do not understand. We needed that money. We were going to lose the house. His business is failing." I looked at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. I thought about the $10,000 non-refundable deposit she had authorized for a luxury SUV just the day before. I did not feel a single shred of sympathy. "You were going to steal my entire estate," I said, keeping my gaze locked firmly on hers. "You were going to manufacture a fraudulent medical diagnosis. You were going to strip away my legal autonomy and leave me with absolutely nothing, just so you could keep playing pretend at the country club." I turned my attention back to the junior wealth manager sitting behind the desk. "Harrison, has the total asset freeze been confirmed across the banking network?" "Yes." "Mrs. Benning," Harrison replied, sitting up very straight, his eyes wide. Every account tied to David and Chloe Benning, including their joint checking, their personal savings, and all affiliated business holding accounts, is now completely locked. No funds can move in or out. David let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. The financial oxygen to his entire life had just been cut off. The commercial lenders were going to seize his empty warehouse next week. The cross-default clause would trigger the immediate foreclosure of his massive suburban home. The credit card companies were going to come for Chloe. They had absolutely nothing left. "Mom, please," David begged. He was practically hyperventilating. The arrogant real estate developer completely replaced by a terrified, broken little boy. "Please, if they freeze my accounts today, I am completely ruined. I will lose everything." "I know," I said. I looked at the forged power of attorney lying face down on the scanner glass. I looked at my son, standing in the middle of the expensive lobby he had tried to rob me in. "Richard," I said, turning to the branch manager, "are the rest of the documents ready? They are waiting inside conference room A." "Helen," Richard confirmed. "Good." I nodded. I looked back at David and Chloe. The absolute, unassailable finality of the moment settled over the room. "You are going to follow us into that room," I told them, my voice barely above a whisper. "And we are going to finish this." Richard Sterling led the way back down the quiet, marble-floored corridor. His footsteps were measured, calm, and completely unhurried. Behind him, the heavy silence of the bank lobby seemed to close in around my son and my daughter-in-law. David and Chloe followed like two people being marched to a hearing they knew they had already lost. David was clutching his leather briefcase against his side as if it were a life jacket in the middle of a freezing ocean. Chloe's head was down, her heavy designer handbag dangling limply from her arm. The oversized, gold-plated logo suddenly looking less like a badge of wealth and more like a brand of shame. We reached conference room A. Richard pulled open the heavy frosted glass door and held it for us. Inside, the room was cool and smelled of dark roast coffee and old paper. Marcus was already sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table. He had neatly arranged several thick, dark blue folders directly in front of his chair. He looked up, his sharp, intelligent eyes fixing entirely on my son with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing an uninteresting specimen under a microscope. Richard motioned for David and Chloe to take the two guest chairs opposite Marcus. They sat down side by side. David's hands were shaking so badly, he had to place them flat on the polished table to keep them from visibly trembling. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was the low, distant hum of the bank's central ventilation system. David could not handle the silence. He broke it first, his voice cracking with a sharp, thick, frantic edge that he tried desperately to mask with authority. "What is the meaning of this?" David demanded, looking from Richard to Marcus, and finally landing on me. "We have business to attend to. That power of attorney is entirely valid. My mother signed it of her own free will. You have no legal right to lock these accounts." Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not even blink. He reached out with one manicured finger and tapped the top dark blue folder. "David," Marcus said, his gravelly baritone filling the room with an absolute crisis. Crushing weight. "Let us talk about what your mother actually signed." Marcus opened the folder. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of my son. It was a copy of the General Durable Power of Attorney that David had shoved under my nose on Thursday evening. David stared down at the paper. For a second, he looked confused, as if he expected it to prove his point. "Do you recognize this document?" David? Marcus asked smoothly. Of course I do. David snapped, his defensiveness flaring up. It grants me full proxy authority. It is notarized by my office. It was signed right in front of witnesses. It was notarized by someone who did not witness the signature. Marcus corrected him, his voice dropping an octave. And more importantly, your brilliant legal template missed a very specific detail. Marcus pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the page. He slid a magnifying loupe across the table next to it. Look at the loupe on the capital letter of your mother's first name. Marcus instructed, leaning back in his chair. And look at the horizontal strike running directly through her last name. David blinked, leaning forward, his eyes scanning the page. That is a distress marker. Marcus continued. In 40 years of corporate law and asset protection, your mother used that specific, deliberate modification every single time a document was signed under duress or threat of coercion. It is not just an invalid signature. It is a legal declaration that the document was obtained by fraud. The color drained entirely from David's face. He looked at the paper. Then he looked up at me, his eyes wide and hollow. You knew, David whispered, the words barely audible in the quiet room. You knew what I was doing the entire time. I did not say a word. I simply looked at him across the table. I let the silence stretch out, heavy and absolute. Chloe could not hold back anymore. She burst out, her voice sharp, piercing, and frantic. All her arrogant facade completely shattered. This is a trap, she screamed, slamming her hand down on the mahogany table. You set us up. You sat there and watched us walk right into it. You are a bitter, cruel old woman who wants to ruin her own family. Marcus did not even look at her. He just turned the page in the blue folder, revealing a detailed financial breakdown. Mrs. Benning is not ruining your family. Chloe, Marcus said, his tone icy and professional. Your credit cards have $80,000 in revolving debt at 26% interest. Your leased luxury SUV has a $10,000 deposit that is about to bounce because your personal checking accounts are frozen. And your commercial real estate holding company is facing a $2.4 million balloon payment by the 30th of this month, which will trigger a cross-default clause and seize your suburban home. Chloe stopped breathing. She stared at Marcus as if he had just read her a death sentence. Every single number, every single hidden debt, every single desperate secret they had tried to bury under expensive designer labels and luxury dinners was suddenly laid bare on the table for everyone to see. The illusion was completely gone. There was no more luxury. There was no more escape. There was only the cold, unyielding reality of what they had built. And the fortress they had tried to destroy. The silence in Conference Room A was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that only happens when a massive lie is suddenly dragged out into the harsh light of day. I watched the fight completely drain out of my daughter-in-law. Her frantic, screaming energy collapsed in an instant. She looked at the financial documents spread across the mahogany table, and then she looked at David. She was waiting for him to fix it. She was waiting for the arrogant, confident real estate developer to pull a miracle out of thin air, just like he always pretended he could. But David had nothing left. He slumped back in his chair, his shoulders completely caved in. He looked small. He looked exactly like a man who had spent his entire life building a house out of playing cards, only to finally feel the wind blow. Richard Sterling folded his hands on top of the table. He did not look sympathetic. He looked like a man doing his job. Because you attempted to execute a transfer of over $2 million using a forged legal document, Richard explained, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The bank is legally required to file a suspicious activity report with the federal authorities. The Internal Fraud Division has already locked the network. We cannot undo this. David, your financial infrastructure within this institution is permanently shut down. David buried his face in his hands. Allo? Pathetic sound escaped his throat. It was not a sob. It was the sound of complete, overwhelming panic. Mom? Please. David whispered through his fingers. He did not even look up at me. Please. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. You have to tell them you gave me permission. If the federal authorities investigate the commercial accounts, my lenders will seize the warehouse by Tuesday. The cross default will hit the house. We will be on the street. I leaned forward slightly. I rested my arms on the cool, polished wood of the table. There was no misunderstanding. David, I said quietly, you brought a fake doctor into my home on Tuesday afternoon. You tried to manufacture a medical record to declare me mentally unfit. You tried to break my mind so you could break into my vault. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a premeditated crime. Chloe's head snapped up. Her eyes darted wildly between me and her husband. The heavy floral perfume she always wore suddenly seemed to mix with the sharp, sour scent of her own cold sweat. We were desperate, Chloe cried out, her voice cracking, completely abandoning her arrogant facade. We were drowning. Helen, David's business was failing. And we just needed a bridge loan. We were going to pay it back. Marcus let out a slow, gravelly sigh. He reached out and tapped the second dark blue folder resting on his side of the table. People who intend to pay a loan back do not usually brag about stealing the money to their friends on the internet, Marcus said smoothly. He flipped the folder open. He took out the thick stack of time-stamped papers I had printed in my study the night they accidentally added me to their group chat. He slid the stack across the table. The heavy paper made a crisp, scratching sound as it moved, stopping right over the forged power of attorney. I watched Chloe look down. I watched her eyes lock onto the printed screenshots. I saw her recognize her own profile picture, her own green text bubbles, her own cruel jokes about the old woman slipping. Seeing your own malice printed out on high-quality legal paper has a very grounding effect on people. Chloe physically recoiled from the table. She pressed her back hard against her chair, clutching her massive designer handbag to her chest as if it could somehow protect her from the evidence. You planned this for 3 months. I told them, keeping my voice perfectly steady. You moved my keys. You hid my mail. You intentionally shut off the power to my house to try and convince me I was losing my grip on reality. I have the security footage of you doing it. Chloe's jaw actually dropped. She looked at David, completely terrified. When the ship finally sinks, the rats always turn on each other. It took exactly 3 seconds for Chloe to throw my son overboard. It was his idea, Chloe screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at her husband. David told me to do it. He said we had to make you look crazy so the doctor would sign the papers. I did not want to do it. Helen, he made me. David's head shot up. He stared at his wife in absolute disbelief. You spent $80,000 on clothes and vacations while we were defaulting on the house, David yelled back, his voice thick with panic and betrayal. You were the one who booked the luxury suite in Vegas with money we did not have. You told me we had to get the trust fund. They sat there in the pristine, quiet conference room of the private wealth management bank, screaming at each other. They sounded like 2 children fighting over a broken toy, completely oblivious to the fact that the adults in the room had already decided their punishment. I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice to stop the argument. I simply watched them tear each other apart. In my 40 years of practicing contract law, I have learned that you never need to destroy a liar. You just put them in a locked room with the truth, and they will completely destroy themselves. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Richard. We all understood that the meeting was effectively over. The trap had closed. The locks had snapped shut. I pushed my chair back from the mahogany table. The legs scraped softly against the carpet. The sound was quiet. But it was enough to make both David and Chloe freeze and look at me. "We are done here," I said, standing up. "Mom." "Wait," David pleaded, scrambling to stand up as well, his hands reaching out across the table, but not daring to touch me. "What are you going to do?" I picked up my purse. I looked at the man I had raised. I looked at the woman who had tried to erase my independence. "I am going to go home." "David," I replied, "and you are going to go figure out how to pack up a 4,000 square foot house before the bank changes the locks?" I turned around and walked toward the frosted glass door. Marcus picked up his leather briefcase and followed right behind me. We left them standing in the middle of the room, completely surrounded by the printed evidence of their own destruction. The walk from the conference room to the front doors of the bank felt incredibly short. The lobby was still hushed. The polished marble floors reflecting the pale winter light, pouring in through the tall glass windows. Behind us, I could still faintly hear the muffled, frantic sounds of Chloe and David arguing through the soundproof glass of conference room A. It was the sound of a paper empire finally collapsing under its own weight. Marcus walked beside me. His footsteps were measured and calm. We stepped out through the heavy double doors and into the freezing winter air. The cold hit my face, sharp and clean, washing away the heavy, suffocating scent of Chloe's expensive floral perfume that had been lingering in my nose all morning. Marcus unlocked his car. A heavy, quiet luxury sedan parked at the curb. We got in. The doors closed with a solid, muffled thud, completely shutting out the noise of the city traffic. "Are you all right, Helen?" Marcus asked. His gravelly voice was remarkably gentle as he started the engine and turned on the heat. I looked out the window at the gray sky. I thought about the question. A normal mother would be devastated. A normal mother would be crying in the passenger seat, mourning the absolute destruction of her relationship with her only child. But I did not feel devastated. I did not feel an ounce of grief. I just felt incredibly, profoundly tired. "I am fine." "Marcus," I said quietly, keeping my eyes on the street, "I am not mourning a son today. I am simply foreclosing on a bad investment." Marcus nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. He put the car in drive, and we pulled away from the curb, leaving my son entirely alone with the consequences of his own arrogance. But simply stopping them at the bank was only the first half of the equation. Locking down the irrevocable trust protected my retirement. But it did not dismantle the false reality David and Chloe had built. To do that, I had to take away the stage they were standing on. Literally. For 5 years, David and Chloe had hosted lavish, expensive parties at their massive, 4,000 square foot suburban estate. They loved to parade their friends through the grand foyer, bragging about the vaulted ceilings and the custom kitchen renovations. They loved to project the image of a highly successful, self-made couple living the ultimate American dream. They conveniently forgot to mention exactly how they acquired that dream in the first place. When David first wanted to buy that house, his commercial real estate business was already showing signs of financial instability. No traditional bank would approve a mortgage of that size without a massive down payment and a pristine credit history. David had neither. So, he came to me. He begged. He promised he just needed a little help to secure the property. Just a temporary boost until his next big commercial deal closed. I did not just hand him the money. I was a contract lawyer for 40 years. I do not do handshakes. And I certainly do not do unconditional loans. I formed a private limited liability company, funded it with my own capital, and purchased the suburban property entirely in cash. I then leased the house back to David, with an ironclad clause that allowed him to build equity over time, provided he never used the property as collateral for any outside business ventures. It was a safety net, a way to help my son build a life while legally protecting the asset from his own inevitable financial recklessness. But as Marcus had discovered during his forensic audit the week before, David had completely ignored that contract. In his absolute desperation to save his failing commercial warehouse project, he had fraudulently claimed full equity in the house to secure a cross-collateralized bridge loan. He had forged the ownership documents. He had gambled with a house he did not actually own. When we arrived back at my quiet home, Marcus walked straight into my study and opened his laptop on my mahogany desk. It was time to pull the final thread. You have the legal right to execute an immediate eviction based on breach of contract and financial fraud, Marcus said, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. Because the house is technically owned by your corporate entity, and because he attempted to leverage it illegally with outside lenders, we can entirely bypass the standard 30-day notice. We can serve them an emergency vacate order by Monday morning. Do it, I said. I did not hesitate for a single second. And the emergency line of credit? Marcus asked, looking up at me from the glowing screen. For the last 3 years, I had secretly acted as a silent guarantor on a high-yield emergency credit line for David's business. It was a fail-safe I had put in place just to make sure he could always make payroll if a deal fell through. He never knew I was the one backing it. He just thought he had charmed a very generous lender. Sever it, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and utterly devoid of any sympathy. Cut it all the way down to 0. Withdraw the guarantor backing completely. Let the commercial lenders see exactly how much leverage he actually has left. Marcus pressed a single key on his laptop. The digital confirmation pinged softly in the quiet room. It was done. With that single keystroke, the secret financial life support I had been providing for years was completely and permanently shut off. By Monday morning, David would not just be locked out of my bank accounts. His commercial lenders would receive an automated notice that his guarantor had pulled out, triggering an immediate call on all his outstanding business loans, and when he drove home in his unpaid luxury car, he would find a bright, neon-colored legal notice taped to his heavy mahogany front door, informing him that he had exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrived to change the locks. I poured 2 cups of hot black coffee. I handed one to Marcus. We sat in the quiet warmth of my study, listening to the bitter winter wind rattle the window panes. I had spent my entire life building a fortress to protect my family. Now, I was finally locking the gates and leaving them out in the cold. Monday morning arrived with a bitter, biting cold that seemed to seep right through the glass windows of my study. I woke up early, made my usual pot of dark roast coffee, and sat by the window watching the frost melt off the bare branches of the oak trees in my front yard. It was an incredibly peaceful morning. For my son, however, Monday morning was the exact moment his entire artificial world violently collapsed. In the financial sector, things do not happen slowly. When a bank decides you are a liability, they do not send you a polite letter asking for a meeting. They drop a guillotine. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the automated systems at David's commercial lending institution registered that his secret guarantor, the safety net I had maintained for 3 years, had formally withdrawn all backing. The reaction was instantaneous. By 8:15, His commercial credit lines were completely frozen. By 8:30, the cross-default clause was officially triggered. The $2.4 million balloon payment was called in immediately. I did not have to be there to know exactly how it happened. Marcus had a junior associate monitoring the public filings, and he called me just before 9 o'clock to give me the update. David had walked into his leased office space downtown, likely wearing one of his expensive tailored suits, completely unaware that he no longer owned a single piece of the company he was standing in. When he tried to log into his administrative accounts to move money between his empty shell companies, the screen simply locked him out. The lenders had already filed the emergency seizure paperwork, action inframini. His warehouse was gone. His business was gone. But the commercial collapse was only the first domino. At exactly 10 o'clock, a county sheriff pulled up to the driveway of David and Chloe's massive 4,000-square-foot suburban estate. Chloe was likely inside, nursing a terrible headache and surrounded by the $80,000 worth of designer clothes she had bought on credit. The sheriff did not knock politely. He taped a bright, neon orange legal notice directly onto the center of their heavy, custom mahogany front door. It was a formal, emergency eviction order. Because David had fraudulently attempted to leverage a house he did not actually own, the standard 30-day grace period was entirely waived. The notice gave them exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before law enforcement returned to physically remove them and change the locks. I sat in my quiet study, sipping my hot coffee, and watched my phone light up. It started just past 11 o'clock. My phone buzzed. Sliding slightly across the polished wood of my desk, the caller ID flashed David's name. I did not pick it up. I just watched the screen glow, to then dim, and then buzz again. He called 4 times in a row. When I did not answer, the voicemails started coming. I waited until the afternoon to listen to them. I wanted to hear the full progression of his reality setting in. I pressed play on the first message. "Mom? Please pick up." David's voice echoed from the small speaker. He sounded completely breathless, as if he had just run a mile in the freezing cold. The commercial bank just seized the warehouse accounts. They locked everything. I cannot even make payroll today. You have to call them. You have to reinstate the guarantor line. Or I am going to be facing federal bankruptcy by Friday. Please. Mom. Just pick up the phone. I deleted the message. I pressed play on the second one. Left an hour later. The tone had completely shifted from panic to absolute despair. Mom? The sheriff was just here. David choked out. I could hear the sound of doors slamming in the background. They served an eviction notice. We have 72 hours. Chloe is losing her mind. She is literally packing her bags right now. She says she is going to stay with her sister in the city, and she is talking about contacting a divorce lawyer. You cannot do this to us. You cannot put your own son out on the street. Call me back. Please. I listened to his voice break. I listened to the sound of his expensive, heavily mortgaged life shattering into a million pieces. A normal mother might have felt a terrible ache in her chest. A normal mother might have picked up the phone, driven over to that house, and offered to fix it. But they had not treated me like a mother. They had treated me like a target. And you do not offer a life jacket to the person who just tried to hold your head underwater. I deleted the second message. The third voicemail was not about the money or the house. It was about the one thing David had managed to completely forget in his panic over his failing business. The criminal consequences. Marcus had not just stopped at the bank accounts and the eviction, while David was dealing with the sheriff. Marcus had sent a courier to David's office. The courier delivered a thick, heavy legal binder. Inside was a formal cease and desist order. barring David and Chloe from ever approaching me or my property again. But more importantly, the binder contained a formal notification that a comprehensive file of evidence, including the security camera footage of Chloe tampering with my power panel, the printed text messages detailing their 3-month conspiracy, and the forged general power of attorney bearing my distress signature, had been officially handed over to the district attorney's office. The state medical board had also received a formal complaint regarding Dr. Evans and his willingness to manufacture a fraudulent dementia diagnosis for a friend. "Mom?" David's voice on the third voicemail was barely a whisper. He was crying. Real. Heavy. Uncontrollable tears. "Marcus just sent the papers." "You sent the forged signature to the district attorney?" "Mom, they are going to charge me with felony fraud. They are going to charge me with elder abuse. I could go to prison. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I was just scared about the business. I never wanted to hurt you. Please, just call Marcus off. I have nothing left." I let the voicemail finish. The automated voice informed me that there were no more messages. I placed the phone back down on the mahogany desk. I looked around my quiet, warm study. I looked at the old, heavy legal encyclopedias lining my shelves. I had spent 40 years building a life out of ironclad rules and absolute boundaries. My son had arrogantly assumed those boundaries did not apply to him. He was right about one thing. He had absolutely nothing left. But the consequences were no longer mine to control. The machine was already in motion, and all he could do now was stand perfectly still and wait for the impact. Tuesday passed in a heavy, quiet blur. I did not hear from my son directly. I did not expect to. I knew from Marcus that David was spending every waking hour frantically bouncing between bankruptcy attorneys, trying to find a single lawyer who would take his incredibly complex, toxic case without requiring a massive, upfront cash retainer. None of them would. In the legal world, word travels extremely fast when a federal fraud investigation is on the table. He was entirely radioactive. Wednesday morning brought the first real snow of the season. It was not a beautiful, crisp winter snow. It was a wet, heavy, miserable sleet that instantly turned the city streets into a frozen, gray slush. It was the absolute perfect backdrop for the reality that was about to hit my son's driveway. David had not made a payment on his prized, leased luxury sedan in over 90 days. With his commercial accounts completely frozen, his credit score in a total freefall, and his business officially seized, the dealership did not waste any time. Marcus had hired a private investigator to keep a quiet eye on the suburban property, simply to ensure that David and Chloe were actually complying with the 72-hour emergency eviction order. Just before noon, the investigator sent Marcus a short, silent video clip. Marcus forwarded it directly to me. I opened the file on my laptop. Sitting in the warm comfort of my quiet study, I watched my son stand in the middle of his freezing driveway. He was wearing an expensive Italian wool overcoat and a pair of light brown suede loafers. It was completely the wrong footwear for the weather. But David had never really been prepared for a storm. I watched the wet, dirty gray slush completely ruin the expensive suede as he stood there, his shoulders hunched against the bitter wind. He was watching a heavy, industrial tow truck winch his beautiful, shining status symbol onto a flatbed. He did not yell. He did not try to argue with the repo driver. He just stood there, looking completely hollow, entirely defeated. He watched the truck secure the chains, shift into gear, and pull away down the street, taking the very last piece of his manufactured wealth with it. But the car was not the only thing leaving him that morning. Less than an hour after the tow truck disappeared, A black rideshare pulled up to the curb. The video clip showed Chloe walking out the heavy mahogany front door. She did not look back. She was dragging two massive, heavily packed designer suitcases through the freezing snow. The financial ruin was terrible. But the moment Chloe realized I had actually handed the forged medical and legal documents over to the district attorney, her survival instincts had completely taken over. She knew she was caught on my hidden security cameras, deliberately tampering with the electrical panel. She knew her text messages, plotting the hostile takeover of my estate, were printed out in high-definition ink. She was absolutely terrified of being indicted as a co-conspirator in a federal fraud case. So, she abandoned ship. She left the man she had conspired with, running back to her sister's small, cramped apartment in the city, desperately trying to put as much physical and legal distance between herself and my son as she possibly could. David was left entirely alone. The massive 4,000-square-foot house, the grand stage they had used for 5 years to mock me and parade their illusion of success, was now just a freezing, echoing tomb. The power company had already issued an automated shut-off warning due to non-payment, though it hardly mattered. The county sheriff was scheduled to arrive at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning to permanently change the locks. Marcus called me later that afternoon. His gravelly voice was completely devoid of pity. The bank's internal fraud division officially filed their report. Marcus told me, attempting to wire $2.4 million using a forged general power of attorney is not a simple civil matter. Helen, it is a felony. The district attorney is moving forward with the elder abuse and fraud charges. David is not just going to lose his business and his home. He is going to be fighting for his freedom. I thanked Marcus and hung up the phone. I looked around my study. The fire was crackling warmly in the hearth. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked in a slow, steady, peaceful rhythm. When you spend your entire life giving everything to your children, people assume your generosity is an endless natural resource. They are simply entitled to mine. They assume that a mother's love means she will always look the other way, that she will always absorb the damage, that she will always be a soft place to land. They forget that the person who built the fortress is also the one holding the keys to the heavy iron gates. And when you decide to treat your own mother like a target, you do not get to complain when she decides to return fire. I poured myself a glass of red wine, sat back in my leather chair, and watched the snow bury the world outside. The storm was finally over. The silence was beautiful. Thursday evening arrived with a bone-chilling freeze. The sleet from the day before had completely turned to solid ice, coating the streets and the bare branches of the oak trees in a thick, glass-like shell. Inside my house, it was warm. The fire was burning steadily in my study. I was sitting in my leather reading chair, going through a few final legal documents Marcus had sent over regarding the trust lockdown. I live at the end of a long, private driveway. Years ago, after my husband passed away, I had a set of heavy wrought iron security gates installed at the entrance. I valued my privacy, and the gates gave me a sense of quiet isolation. I never imagined that one day, the person I would be locking out would be the baby I had brought home from the hospital 38 years ago. Just past 7 o'clock. The security chime in my study softly echoed through the room. I set my papers down. I turned to the small digital monitor on my desk that fed live video from the camera mounted at the front gates. It was David. He did not have a car. His leased luxury sedan had been repossessed the day before, and his bank accounts were entirely frozen, meaning he could not even call a taxi or a rideshare. He must have walked the 3 miles from his freezing bracks, vatted in it as ace. Empty suburban house in the dark. He looked absolutely terrible. He was still wearing the expensive Italian wool overcoat, but it was ruined. Soaked through with freezing rain and stiff with ice. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He was shivering so violently, I could see it through the grainy black and white feed of the security camera. He walked up to the heavy iron gate and wrapped his bare hands around the freezing metal bars. He pressed his face against them, looking up the long, dark driveway toward the warm lights of my house. He stood there for a long time, just shaking in the cold. Then, he reached out and pressed the intercom buzzer. The chime echoed in my study again. I did not move. I just watched him on the screen. "Mom." His voice came through the small speaker on my desk. It was tinny, metallic, and completely broken. "Mom, please. I know you are in there. Please, just talk to me." There is a very powerful, primitive instinct built into every mother. When you hear your child cry, when you hear them in pain, your body physically reacts. Your chest tightens. Your immediate impulse is to run to them, to open the door, to pull them inside and make the world stop hurting them. It is a biological response. And for a fleeting second, sitting in my warm study, I felt it. But then I remembered the text messages. I remembered him calling me the old woman. I remembered him planning to bring a fake doctor into my living room to declare me mentally unfit. I remembered the absolute arrogant joy on his face in that restaurant video when he thought he had successfully stolen my entire life. I reached out and pressed the button to activate the microphone. I did not press the button to open the gates. "You are violating a formal cease and desist order." "David," I said, my voice carried out through the cold night air, projecting from the speaker mounted on the stone pillar by the street. It sounded calm, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. David flinched at the sound of my voice. He gripped the iron bars tighter. "Mom, please," he sobbed, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I have absolutely nothing. Chloe left me. The house is completely empty. And the sheriff is coming to change the locks tomorrow morning. I went to 5 different criminal defense lawyers today. They all want a $50,000 cash retainer just to take the case. I do not even have $50. Mom, I am going to prison." He leaned his forehead against the cold iron. He was crying. Heavy, uncontrollable tears. "I am so sorry." He begged into the intercom. "I was stupid. I was so arrogant. I just wanted to save the business. I never meant to actually hurt you. Please. Mom, you are the only person left in the world who can help me. Just open the gate. Please. Let me come inside. Just let me get warm." I looked at the screen. I looked at the broken man standing in the ice. In my 40 years of practicing contract law, I learned one absolute, undeniable truth. A boundary without a consequence is not a boundary at all. It is just a suggestion. If you write a contract and someone breaches it, you cannot just forgive them because they are crying. If you do, the contract is completely worthless, and they will just break it again the moment it is convenient for them. "David," I said quietly, leaning closer to the microphone, "you did not come here tonight because you love me. You did not come here because you are genuinely sorry for trying to steal my independence. You came here because you ran out of options, and you want to use me as a life raft one last time." "That is not true," he cried out, his voice cracking violently. "It is exactly true," I replied, my tone sharpening into a cold, clinical edge. "When you thought you had outsmarted me, when you thought that forged piece of paper was going to give you $2.4 million, I was not your mother. I was just an obstacle. I was just an old woman who was in your way. Mom, please do not do this." he whimpered, sliding down slightly against the heavy gates. A contract is only valid if it is enforced. I told him, and I am enforcing my boundaries. You made a choice to treat me like a target. Now, you are going to experience the exact, unshielded consequences of that choice. I took my finger off the microphone button. "Mom!" David screamed through the speaker, the sound desperate and hollow. "Mom, please, open the gate." I reached forward and pressed the power button on the security monitor. The screen went completely black. The speaker went dead. The heavy, peaceful silence of my study rushed back in, entirely washing away the sound of my son's panic. I sat in my chair for a long time, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. I did not call the police to report him for violating the restraining order. I simply let him stand out in the freezing cold until he finally realized that the heavy iron gates were never, ever going to open for him again. Friday morning broke with brilliant, blinding sunlight. The bitter ice storm from the night before had passed, leaving the world completely still and glittering in the cold, sharp light. I woke up at 6 o'clock, just like I always do. I walked into my quiet kitchen and made a pot of Earl Grey tea. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound in the house. I did not turn on the television. I did not look at my phone. I simply carried my warm cup into the glass conservatory at the back of my house and sat down in the quiet, comforting warmth of the morning sun. I thought about my late husband, Arthur. He was a gentleman. He always told me I was too hard on David. He believed that if we just gave our son enough time, enough financial support, and enough love, he would eventually grow out of his arrogance and learn how to build something real. Arthur did not live long enough to see the final result of that unconditional leniency. He did not live to see his son try to manufacture a medical diagnosis to steal the very foundation we had spent our entire lives building. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded. It was Marcus. He stepped into the foyer, brushing the freezing winter air from his tailored charcoal coat. He was carrying a single, thin manila folder. We did not go into the study. We went into the kitchen. I poured him a cup of dark black coffee. "It is done," Marcus said quietly. Setting the folder down on the granite counter, I took a slow sip of my tea. I waited for him to finish the report. The county sheriff executed the emergency eviction order at 9 o'clock this morning. Marcus continued, his gravelly voice echoing slightly in the bright kitchen. David was already gone. He packed whatever he could fit into a cheap rented moving van and left the house keys on the kitchen island. The bank has officially taken possession of the property. The locks have been changed. I looked out the window. I pictured the massive 4,000 square foot house. I thought about the grand mahogany foyer where Chloe used to parade her heavy designer bags, and the expensive dining room where my son used to pour vintage wine and complain about the burden of his own success. It was all completely empty now. It was just a hollow, echoing shell waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder to cover his massive commercial defaults. "Where did he go?" I asked, my voice completely steady. "He signed a month-to-month lease on a tiny, one-bedroom apartment in an industrial park on the far edge of the city," Marcus replied. "It was the only place that would take him without a background check and a pristine credit score. His commercial lenders are filing the final liquidation papers today. He has absolutely nothing left to his name." "And the criminal charges?" I asked. "The district attorney formally filed the preliminary injunctions yesterday afternoon," Marcus said, tapping his manicured index finger against the thin folder. "They are moving forward with felony financial fraud and attempted elder abuse. David has his first arraignment on Tuesday morning. Because his accounts are entirely frozen and he cannot afford a private defense attorney, he has been assigned a public defender. I closed my eyes for a brief second. A public defender? My son. A man who used to wear imported Italian wool suits and drive a luxury sedan that cost more than most people earn in 3 years, was going to be standing in a crowded courtroom, relying on an overworked, underpaid state lawyer to keep him out of federal prison. The absolute, unyielding reality of his fall was staggering. Chloe filed for divorce. Marcus added smoothly. I opened my eyes. I was not entirely surprised. She filed the paperwork yesterday morning. Marcus explained. A faint, cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. She is desperately trying to untangle herself from his legal ruin. She moved into her sister's cramped apartment in the city. She has already started selling her expensive designer handbags on the internet just to afford a retainer for her own criminal defense attorney. She told her lawyers that David manipulated her into the entire scheme. I let out a soft, humorless breath. Unfortunately for her, I noted. We documented her intent. Exactly. Marcus nodded. The district attorney has the printed text messages where she joked about taking your money. They have the high-definition security camera footage of her deliberately tampering with your electrical panel to try and convince you that you were losing your mind. She is not going to escape the conspiracy charges just by dropping his last name. They had built a glittering tax pressoir. Expensive life entirely out of lies and borrowed money. And the exact moment the money disappeared, their loyalty evaporated right along with it. They were turning on each other like starving animals, fighting over the scraps of an empire they never actually owned in the first place. I looked at the thin folder on the counter. It contained the final legal confirmations, the permanent revocation of all proxies, the absolute lockdown of the Benning Family Trust. My fortress was completely secure. Thank you, Marcus, I said softly. For everything. Marcus finished his coffee. He buttoned his heavy charcoal coat. You protected yourself. Helen, that is all you did. You survived the ambush. He let himself out. The heavy front door clicked shut, sealing the quiet warmth back inside my home. I walked back into the glass conservatory. The morning sun was much higher now, casting long, bright shadows across the floor. I sat down in my leather chair. The house was incredibly quiet. It was the kind of deep, heavy quiet that only comes after a terrible storm finally breaks. I was entirely alone. My son was gone. The grand illusion of my happy family was completely shattered. But as I sat there, feeling the warmth of the sun through the glass, I did not feel empty. I felt safe. I felt an absolute, profound sense of peace. It has been 6 months since that Friday morning at the private wealth management bank. The bitter winter eventually melted into spring. And now the heavy summer heat is pressing against the glass windows of my conservatory. The legal system moves incredibly slowly, but it moves with absolute, crushing certainty. David's commercial bankruptcy was finalized in late May. His failing real estate empire was completely liquidated to satisfy his lenders. He is currently living in that tiny, one-bedroom apartment on the industrial edge of the city. To pay for his basic living expenses and to afford the mounting fees for his public defender, he took a job working the night shift at a logistics warehouse. The man who used to wear tailored Italian wool suits and drive a luxury SUV now wears a high-visibility vest and clocks in at midnight. His trial for felony financial fraud and attempted elder abuse begins in late October. Chloe's desperate attempt to escape the sinking ship did not save her. The district attorney saw right through her victim narrative, the time-stamped text messages from her Vegas group chat, combined with the high-definition security camera footage of her deliberately tampering with my electrical panel. were simply too damning. She is facing federal conspiracy charges right alongside the husband she tried to abandon. They spend their days in separate courtrooms, pointing fingers at each other, desperately trying to put out a fire they built together. Sometimes, I sit in my quiet study and think back to that one specific Friday evening. I think about the simple, soft ping of a cell phone, a clumsy thumb hitting the wrong contact name. It is terrifying to realize how incredibly fragile our illusions really are. If Chloe had just been a little more careful, if she had simply double-checked the recipient list before sending that message, my entire reality would have been destroyed. I might be sitting in a state-run nursing home right now. I might be heavily medicated, completely stripped of my legal autonomy, while my son and his wife drank expensive champagne in my living room and spent my life savings on designer handbags. In my 40 years of practicing contract law, I saw every possible kind of human betrayal. I watched partners steal from partners, siblings sue siblings, and trusted friends completely dismantle successful companies out of sheer, blinding greed. I always wanted to believe that the cold, clinical world of corporate law was fundamentally different from the warm, unconditional world of a family. I was completely wrong. Family is a contract. It is an unwritten, deeply emotional agreement built on mutual respect, care, and trust. But just like any legal document, when one party decides to act in extreme bad faith, that contract is completely nullified. You do not owe your infinite loyalty to people who are actively plotting your destruction. You do not owe your financial resources to people who view you as nothing more than a bank account. And you absolutely do not owe your sanity to children who are willing to manufacture a fraudulent dementia diagnosis just to fund their fake, hollow lifestyle. Society will tell you that family is everything. People will tell you that you should always forgive, always turn the other cheek, and always keep the door open, no matter how terribly you are treated. But I have learned a very different lesson. Boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are the armor you put on when the people who claim to love you decide that you are just a number in their portfolio. My son made a calculated choice to choose money over his mother. So, I simply made sure he ended up with neither. I am 69 years old. I live entirely alone in a 4,000 square foot house. The heavy, suffocating scent of expensive floral perfume is completely gone. The loud, aggressive clicking of stiletto heels on my hardwood floors is a distant memory. Some people might look at my life from the outside and think it is a tragedy. They might think I am just a bitter, lonely old woman who lost her only child. But as I sit here in my garden this morning, drinking my Earl Grey tea and listening to the birds sing in the old oak trees, I do not feel tragic. I do not feel lonely. I feel incredibly profoundly free. The ghost is gone from the machine, and the house is finally quiet. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you believe that respect has to be earned and never simply assumed, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. There is always another story waiting to be told. And I will see you in the next one.